At 600 hours, November 20th, 1943, the lagoon at Tarawa boiled with fire. The U.S. Navy's guns had already roared through the night, and now the Marines of the 2nd Division climbed down into their Higgins boats, hearts pounding as the sea foamed with steel. Smoke rose in sheets from Betio Island, a tiny strip of coral that bristled with Japanese bunkers. From inside, defenders huddled in reinforced pillboxes of coconut logs and steel plates, convinced that no weapon short of a battleship's main guns could dislodge them. They had reason to believe it. The bunkers had been built to absorb artillery. Yet within hours, Japanese soldiers would watch in disbelief as something far smaller, stubby tubes carried on men's shoulders, unleashed devastation that shattered concrete, timber, and morale alike. U.S. Marine Corps Combat Report, Tarawa, Nov. 1943. The first waves stumbled in the surf, machine gun tracers tearing across the shallows. Marines clutched their rifles, but what they dragged ashore with equal desperation were the steel tubes strapped to their packs, 60mm and 81mm mortars. Compact, light compared to artillery, they looked unimpressive against the looming fortress bunkers. Yet when the first rounds thumped from their muzzles, a strange new rhythm joined the battle. A hollow metallic ploop, an arc through the smoke-choked air, then a detonation that sent logs and sandbags flying in showers of splinters. The Japanese, expecting the slow thunder of field guns, instead faced an invisible rain of explosives descending from above. Their trenches had been built to deflect frontal fire, their pillboxes to withstand shells that slammed horizontally. But mortars ignored such defenses. They came from the sky. U.S. Army After-Action Report, Tarawa, 1943. The island was only 2 miles long, half a mile wide, a postage stamp of death in the Pacific. More than 4,500 Japanese defenders occupied it, under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki. His doctrine was brutal and uncompromising. Every man will kill 10 of the enemy before dying. Japanese Naval Order, 1943. The bunkers, over 500 in total, were the backbone of that defiance. Constructed with palm trunks as thick as a man's torso, reinforced with steel, covered with meters of sand, they were engineered to resist ship guns and aerial bombs. Marines approaching them felt like ants assaulting a fortress wall. And yet, the mortar gave them reach. Firing from shallow craters or even behind burning wreckage, teams of 2 or 3 could loft rounds that curved over walls and plunge directly through firing slits or onto roofs. Japanese machine gun crews, who believed themselves invulnerable behind layers of timber and earth, suddenly saw their positions erupt in flame. Bundesarchiv, Captured Japanese Officer Interrogation, 1944. The Japanese confusion was immediate. Radios buzzed inside their command posts. How could such small teams generate so much destruction? Marines were not dragging heavy howitzers ashore. They had no armored support in the first waves. And yet bunkers collapsed one by one, their interiors blackened, defenders crushed or burned. Dramatized composite. It is impossible, one Japanese lieutenant was said to have whispered, as a mortar round burst through the firing aperture of his pillbox, killing his crew instantly. For the Americans, mortars were not new. They had trained with them in San Diego, on the beaches of New River, and across island exercises. But Tarawa marked one of the first times in the Pacific where these light indirect fire weapons became the decisive edge in breaching Japanese fortifications. The 60mm mortar, only 19 pounds in weight, could be carried by a single Marine. Its shells weighed 3 pounds apiece, enough to rip apart log bunkers. The 80mm mortar, heavier and requiring a crew, had double the punch with rounds weighing nearly 7 pounds, capable of collapsing roofs outright. Technical Manual TM 9307, 1942. The soundscape of Betio was transformed. Amid the screams, the rattle of Arisaka rifles and the hammer of Nambu machine guns came the steady cadence of mortars. Ploop, 5 seconds of silence, then a blast, a bunker caving inward, men crying inside. One Japanese survivor later described the terror. It was as if the sky itself was dropping bombs without airplanes. U.S. Marine Oral History Collection, 1945. By mid-morning, entire sectors of the Japanese defense line were reduced not by naval barrages or flamethrowers, but by relentless mortar fire that Marines coordinated with hand signals and shouted corrections. These were not precise instruments by modern standards. Accuracy depended on instinct, quick calculations, and raw courage under fire. Gunners hunched low, tubes braced in sand, adjusting elevation by degrees while enemy bullets clipped the air around them. Still, round after round landed where they needed to, cracking the backbone of positions that had been expected to hold for weeks. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Volta II, 1946. The broader context of 1943 made this all the more shocking. Japan still commanded vast stretches of the Pacific. From the Aleutians to the Solomons, their armies dug in across island chains, daring the United States to pay in blood for every yard of coral sand. American doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower, yet at Tarawa, the logistical nightmare of shallow reefs left much of that firepower stranded offshore. Sherman tanks drowned in the surf. Heavy artillery could not be landed until days later. What reached the beach first were rifles, grenades, and mortars. And, against all expectation, it was the mortars that leveled the field. The Japanese had gambled everything on their bunkers. Shibasaki himself had declared, "1 million men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. His garrison believed it. They were dug in, camouflaged, disciplined, but no bunker was designed to resist explosives falling vertically, with pinpoint persistence. Mortars exploited the one vulnerability the defenders had overlooked, the roof. Within hours, the invincible fortress became a death trap. Captured diary, 3rd Special Naval Landing Force, 1943. By the afternoon of the first day, Marines pushed inland not by brute force alone, but by the rhythm of mortar crews clearing paths bunker by bunker. Survivors recalled how their advance was almost choreographed. Squads pinned by machine gun fire, mortar teams set up within yards, 2 or 3 quick shots lofted into the air, and suddenly the fire slackened, silence broken only by secondary explosions inside enemy strongpoints. Then the rush forward, bayonets fixed, flamethrowers finishing what mortars had begun. U.S. Marine Corps Infantry Training Film, 1944. The Japanese defenders could not adapt quickly. Their doctrine emphasized close defense, charging machine gun nests or relying on naval guns from the sea, none of which materialized. Mortar fire isolated them, crushed morale, and disoriented command structures. As one Marine later said, it wasn't just the explosions. It was the knowledge that no cover was safe. The bunkers they thought indestructible became coffins. Marine Memoir, 1947. Tarawa's cost was horrific. Over 1,000 Marines killed, nearly 2,300 wounded, in just 76 hours of fighting. But the Japanese garrison of 4,500 was annihilated, with only 17 prisoners taken alive. And in the balance of those brutal days, mortars had proven themselves not as auxiliary weapons, but as the decisive equalizer against some of the most fortified defenses in the Pacific. As night fell on that first day, the Marines dug in, bloodied but unbroken. The Japanese still held positions, their commanders urging fanatical resistance. Yet something fundamental had shifted. For the defenders who had believed their bunkers indestructible, the impossible had already happened. Their fortress walls had fallen to small portable weapons carried by men they had underestimated. The battlefield had become a proving ground for a hidden advantage the Americans had refined, but the Japanese had never truly anticipated. And as the second day of fighting dawned, a larger truth would begin to emerge, one that explained why mortars, not tanks or artillery, would define the tempo of Pacific Island warfare. A truth born not only of weapon design but of doctrine, logistics, and the engineers who had crafted the tubes that shattered concrete. Because the Japanese defenders of Tarawa were about to learn, the mortars were only the beginning. Dawn of the second day, November 21, 1943. The smoke over Baitio hung like a shroud, and the tide lapped gently against the reef still littered with wrecked landing craft. Marines crouched in shell holes, eyes burning from smoke and exhaustion, but their mortar tubes gleamed faintly in the early light. For the Japanese defenders, the shock of the first day had not worn off. Bunkers designed to defy battleships had collapsed beneath weapons no longer than a man's arm. Yet the full secret of the American mortar, its versatility, precision, and relentless supply chain, was still to be revealed. U.S. Navy Log, Tarawa, Nov, 1943. The mortar was the hidden advantage of American infantry, a weapon underestimated even by some of their own commanders. While artillery demanded trucks and flat ground, and tanks needed landing craft and fuel, The mortar traveled lightly on the shoulders of men. A 60mm tube, only 19 pounds, could be dug in within seconds. Crews of 2 or 3 Marines could set up anywhere, a trench, a crater, even the shadow of a palm tree. They needed no roads, no armor, no waiting for engineers. They needed only courage, steady hands, and the supply of rounds ferried ashore under fire. Technical Manual TM 9307, 1942. The Japanese had assumed these tubes were minor infantry support weapons, incapable of breaching fortifications. But the genius lay in the trajectory. Where bullets struck walls and artillery flattened the ground, mortars ignored geometry. Their arcs carried shells over walls and down through roofs, plunging into the very heart of a pillbox. Bureau of Ordnance Report 1943. The 60mm M2 mortar, standard issue, had a range of 1,135 yards. Each shell carried a half-pound of TNT, enough to obliterate log barriers when concentrated. The heavier 81mm M1 mortar, introduced in 1942, could lob shells over 3,000 yards, with a 6.9-pound high-explosive warhead that rivaled small artillery pieces. Its base plate absorbed recoil, allowing rapid fire up to 18 rounds a minute. At Tarawa, Marines often fired until the barrel glowed red, dunking the steel in seawater to cool it before resuming. Field Test Report, 2nd Marine Division, 1943. Factories back home had perfected their production. The Watervliet Arsenal in New York and the American Radiator Company of Chicago manufactured thousands of tubes monthly. General Electric, Westinghouse, and smaller steel mills provided alloys resistant to barrel warping under heat. Every round represented the hands of workers, often women, loading TNT, pressing fins, and sealing fuses. It was their precision, built in assembly lines thousands of miles away, that allowed Marines to fire blindly over walls and still hit with uncanny consistency. War Production Board Report 1943. By contrast, Japanese infantry relied on the Type 89 grenade discharger, nicknamed the knee mortar by American troops. It was light and feared in close jungle fighting, but its range was under 700 yards. Its warhead small. It could harass but not collapse fortresses. Against bunkers, it was a nuisance, not a solution. The Americans had transformed the mortar into something far more devastating. A fortress killer carried by infantry. Captured Japanese Technical Manual 1943. The difference became clear on the second day at Tarawa. Japanese positions still held around the airfield. Machine gun nests choked every advance. Snipers fired from palm tops and fortified blockhouses guarded approaches. Marines were pinned, casualties mounting. Then mortar crews began their work. Spotters crawled forward, peering through binoculars, shouting coordinates. 2 degrees left. Elevate half a notch. The tubes angled skyward. Ploop, ploop, ploop. A dozen shells arced in sequence, their trails invisible but their destinations precise. One bunker vanished in an eruption of fire. Another crumbled as its sandbagged roof collapsed. A third fell silent after 2 direct hits through its firing slit. 2nd Marine Regiment Action Report, Nov. 1943. Survivors among the Japanese garrison reported disbelief. They had built their defenses expecting battleship bombardment, not handheld artillery. Dramatized composite. How do these Americans carry cannons on their backs? A Japanese ensign allegedly cried as yet another pillbox folded inward beneath mortar fire. To the defenders, it seemed the Marines had discovered a way to summon artillery from thin air. The Marines paired mortars with relentless infantry pushes. Squad leaders called in fire as their men hugged the ground. Within moments, a wall of explosions opened a path. Mortars were flexible in a way artillery never could be. They could clear sniper nests, silence machine guns, even detonate hidden ammunition caches. At Tarawa, one well-placed 81mm round set off a secondary explosion that ripped through an entire trench network, killing dozens of defenders instantly. U.S. Army Ordnance Summary 1944. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese defenders who had trained to endure artillery barrages broke under the constant, unpredictable rain of mortar shells. Unlike naval bombardments, which ended before infantry landings, mortars were continuous, intimate, unrelenting. Every few minutes, a new eruption. No pause, no reprieve. One Marine later recalled, "It was like carrying thunder in our pockets." Marine Memoir, 1946. This advantage was not just tactical, It was logistical genius. Mortar shells were compact enough to be ferried ashore by hand. Ammunition carriers waded through chest-deep surf, crates balanced on shoulders, bullets snapping overhead. Each crate held the power to erase a bunker. In comparison, moving a single artillery piece ashore required hours, cranes, and heavy tractors, impossible under fire. Mortars ensured the Marines never lacked indirect firepower, even when isolated on the beachhead. Pacific Logistics Board, 1945. One of the most decisive moments came on the afternoon of November 22nd, as Marines pushed toward the Japanese command post near the island's western tip. Shibasaki had been killed the day before, but his officers rallied survivors around a final bastion, interlocking bunkers reinforced with steel and coral. Assaults stalled, flamethrower teams were cut down, tanks bogged in craters could not advance. For hours the battle teetered. Then the mortars spoke. From a shallow crater, Marines of the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines fired 81 mm rounds in steady rhythm. Spotters directed fire into the heart of the strongpoint. Explosions rippled across the compound, one after another, collapsing roofs, silencing machine guns and killing command staff within. The bastion broke. Survivors scattered. The road to the western shore lay open. 1st Battalion, 6th Marines report, Nov 1943. Even Japanese records later acknowledged the weapon's unexpected dominance. Dramatized composite from interrogation, 1944. We thought only battleships could bring such destruction, but the Americans, they carried it with them. In those hours on Betio, the mortar ceased to be a support weapon. It became the spearhead, the decisive equalizer. Its technical specifications, refined by engineers in American factories, and its battlefield flexibility, gave Marines the ability to crack defenses no doctrine had prepared for. More than naval bombardment, more than tanks, more than rifles, it was the humble mortar that reduced Tarawa's impregnable fortress to ruins. And this was only the beginning. Across the Pacific, from Saipan to Peleliu, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, mortars would become the silent killer of bunkers, caves, and tunnels. What had stunned the Japanese at Tarawa would soon become a pattern, a nightmare repeated across the islands they swore to defend to the death. But the impact of mortars was not only tactical. Their rain of fire left scars not only on concrete and coral, but on the minds of men. For American infantry, they became a lifeline, portable artillery that followed wherever they went. For Japanese defenders, they became an omen, the sound of defeat descending from the sky. And by war's end, the mortar's psychological power would prove as important as its physical destruction. It wasn't only the walls of bunkers that collapsed. It was the will of men inside them. The guns fell silent on Betio after 76 hours of relentless slaughter. The island, once declared impregnable by Admiral Shibasaki, was reduced to rubble, its palm trees charred skeletons, its sands soaked in blood. Over 1,000 Marines lay dead, nearly 2,300 more wounded. On the Japanese side, out of 4,500 defenders, barely a handful survived. Yet amid the devastation, one truth had become impossible to ignore. It was not battleships, nor tanks, nor even flamethrowers alone that had broken the fortress. It was the mortars, those squat steel tubes carried ashore on men's backs, that had tipped the balance. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific, 1946. The strategic significance of mortars extended far beyond Tarawa. Across the Pacific, from the volcanic cliffs of Saipan to the limestone ridges of Peleliu, and from the black sands of Iwo Jima to the coral ridges of Okinawa, the same pattern repeated. Japanese defenders constructed intricate webs of caves, tunnels, and pillboxes. They believed these fortifications immune to anything less than a direct battleship bombardment, but mortars fired at close range proved the constant equalizer. Unlike naval guns that fired once and moved on, mortars could be sustained, adjusted, repeated, and carried directly into the fight. They became the infantry's artillery, a weapon that erased the vast gap between the firepower of fleet and front line. U.S. Army Ordnance Summary, 1945. The psychological weight of this weapon was profound. Survivors of Tarawa and later campaigns reported that Japanese soldiers came to fear the hollow ploop more than any other sound on the battlefield. It was a sound of inevitability. No cover felt secure, no stronghold safe. Mortar rounds ignored trenches, bypassed frontal armor, and fell from the sky without warning. A former Japanese officer, interrogated after the war, admitted, "Dramatized composite. We trained to endure bombardments, to survive artillery, to counter tanks with mines. But this rain from the heavens, always present, always precise, we could not stop it. It broke our spirit before it broke our bodies." Post-war interrogation report, 1946. For the Americans, the mortar became more than a tool of destruction. It was a lifeline. Infantry squads knew that even when cut off, even when tanks bogged down or radios failed, mortar crews could provide firepower on demand. The men trusted their mortar teams, calling them angels in the dirt. In after-action reports, commanders praised the speed and courage of mortar crews who crawled forward under fire, set up in craters and fired until their barrels glowed red. 2nd Marine Division War Diary, Novta, 1943. Behind this frontline heroism lay the quiet work of engineers and production lines back home. The Waterfleet arsenal's precision in machining tubes, the Detroit steel mills forging baseplates, the women of Chicago pressing fuses, every detail mattered. The mortar's effectiveness was not magic, but metallurgy and mass production. Without the factories, without the relentless output of the American war machine, the Marines would have run dry. In truth, each bunker destroyed on Betio was a joint kill. Marine courage paired with American industry. War Production Board Report, 1944. The mortar also reshaped doctrine. Commanders began to structure assaults with mortar fire as the central enabler. Spotters became critical, learning to read terrain and wind to drop rounds with uncanny precision. Entire battles were fought around the rhythm of mortar barrages. At Iwo Jima, Marines carried extra shells forward by hand, knowing that without mortars, Japanese cave systems could not be neutralized. At Okinawa, battalions coordinated massed mortar fire to silence ridgetop defenses, unleashing up to 1,000 rounds in a single hour. U.S. Marine Corps Tactical Report, Okinawa, 1945. The psychological divide widened as the war dragged on. For Marines, mortars meant confidence, the assurance of firepower at their backs. For Japanese defenders, mortars meant dread, the knowledge that every position, no matter how carefully built, was temporary. Over time, captured diaries reflected despair. Dramatized composite, our bunkers are death chambers. The Americans throw their shells from nowhere. The sky itself belongs to them. Captured diary, Okinawa, 1945. This advantage endured into the post-war era. The lessons of Tarawa and the island campaigns etched themselves into American doctrine. Mortars were no longer seen as mere support weapons, but as integral to infantry identity. During the Korean War, U.S. forces employed mortars extensively in mountainous terrain, where traditional artillery was less effective. In Vietnam, mortars provided fire-based defense and jungle firepower. In the Gulf War, they became vital in mobile infantry formations. And today, in modern network-centric warfare, mortars, now often computer-guided, still echo the lesson of Tarawa. Speed, portability, and constant indirect fire outweigh brute strength alone. U.S. Army Field Manual, 1987. But the story of mortars is not only technical. It is human. The men who hefted tubes across reefs under fire. The ammunition carriers who staggered through surf with crates of shells. The engineers who ensured every fin was balanced, every fuse reliable. And the countless lives lost in the shadows of bunkers. Proof of how even the smallest weapon could change the fate of thousands. For veterans, the memory endures. Survivors of Tarawa spoke with awe of their mortar crews, calling them the unsung heroes. "They saved us," one Marine said decades later. "Every time we thought we were done, they dropped fire on the enemy's head." Oral History Interview, 1965. By the war's end, the Japanese had learned a bitter truth. Their fortifications, once the pride of their engineers, were no match for an enemy that carried artillery on its shoulders. Mortars had stripped them of their one certainty, the safety of cover. And when cover falls, morale falls with it. As the Pacific War shifted toward victory, the mortar's legacy grew. It was not glamorous like tanks, not thunderous like battleships, not soaring like aircraft. But it was everywhere. It was constant. It was feared. And it changed the way modern armies thought about firepower. In the words of one Marine veteran, dramatized composite, "The rifle won us the ground. The mortar kept us alive to take it, And so the lesson of Tarawa and the Pacific endures. In war, strength is not always measured in the size of guns or the thickness of armor. Sometimes it is measured in the hands of men kneeling in sand, sighting a simple tube and sending death arcing through the smoke. In modern war, as in 1943, the truth remains: connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor. Mortars proved that even the mightiest walls can fall, not to the heaviest guns but to the smallest weapons, perfectly placed.